for 30 minutes, we certainly pulled in a lot of different themes, all of which are important, I think, to trying to support children and adults with autism and their families. I'd like now to throw it open to questions from the audience. If we have any more from web streaming, that will be passed to us in paper. And also the questions that you have for Jonathan. There is a microphone set up over here, and I would really ask you to use it so that people can hear it, and so that when we use this by any recording that we do of parts of this day, we also have that. So questions, or would anyone, Jonathan, would you like to start while people line up, 10 deep? Sure. Would you like to start by by perhaps responding to what you heard today?
Yeah, I was nodding my head a lot because, first of all, it's impressive to hear that there's a Ministry of Mental Health. That's surprising. I didn't know that. Not knowing BC politics very well.
It's only a week.
Okay, so obviously, with an entire ministry dedicated to mental health, one would hope that there would be a dedicated effort for underserved populations, not just autism, but recognizing the need, recognizing diversity within mental health care. Hopefully there's an opportunity with a dedicated ministry to address that, rather than looking at it as something that should happen off the side of one's desk. But actually with a concerted effort with measures and indicators of progress over time. I completely agree with the recommendations that the panel just suggested, and I think the same issues that are confronted here and the same things that need to happen in Ontario. The only thing to add to this, I think, would be, I get questions a lot like, how do I get better at, how do I get ready to deliver CBT? And one thing I often think of is now, there are a lot of ways to start, certainly through co-supervision or supervision by people with areas of gaps to help you with your decision making and your debriefing afterwards. But also there's the opportunity to grab and be a part of, look for opportunities where there are structured interventions that are being provided around mental health and autism right now in the community. Get involved in helping to deliver those, and try to get a broad range of interventions under your belt, rather than getting stuck on any one treatment manual or any one kind of initiative. Get exposure to and practice with in numbers, because when you start to develop a core set of principles that you could work with, rather than then you get away from being a technologist, and then you really can start being a therapist. And I think that's really important, that distinction, that we're not inserting specific techniques into a person with the idea of rectifying them, but instead we're helping people cope the best possible way across their life course, right? So I think that's a next step, just to build on what people are saying.
One of the things that, no, actually, we're going to go right to this person here.
Sorry, I'm short. I just thought that I would see if there's an opportunity to pick some of the brains at the table right now, because we were talking about supporting families, supporting youth.
I can hardly hear you, sorry.
Supporting families, supporting youth, and the vast amount of kind of people that are in play when it comes to someone with ASD and mental health, because we're looking at MCFT, child and youth mental health. We're probably looking at the health system for diagnosis, then maybe COISN, and then the school. And so from your experience, is there a straighter path? Is there some maybe hidden hints around gathering the experts at the table and coming up with a more distinct plan for supporting the youth and the family?
I'm going to put that in Georgina's bailiwick, because Kelly doesn't want to answer it. No. I'm going to ask Georgina because of your experience in the school system, Georgina.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have the answer to that question, but certainly it's very convoluted and fragmented is what I would say the current situation is. There are absolutely pockets of excellence out there in various organizations and across ministries, but again, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think there needs to be much greater collaboration between ministries that are supporting. If we just focused on individuals with ASD, and then those individuals with ASD who have mental health concerns, who have housing concerns, who have employment concerns, who have educational concerns, whose families need support, there's a lot, right? And there's targeted support through MCFD, for example. For families, there's targeted assessment funding through a Ministry of Health. There's school districts get their own funding, and then POPARD has a limited number of staff who can consult with school districts regarding what's available within education. And all of us try, at least at POPARD, we do reach out to the schools and the families and say, if you have private service providers involved, if you have a social worker involved, we welcome their participation at the table. And something I've started saying to my consultants is, when we have a student with a diagnosed mental health disorder, that we are requiring them to have representation, whoever it is working with them at the table, because there's no point, one of my teachers say, if that's their background, going in to consult and the primary issue is OCD, for example. We need more than that. So I guess just pushing for those collaborations, but that, I don't know if that's really the answer, or if you wanted to add anything, Kelly, being involved with the ministry.
I don't think I have the answer either, but I think that it's just a matter of trying to find people who are comfortable with, because autism is a mental health condition. It's in the DSM. So people who are comfortable working with the whole range of mental health disorders will be better off in being able to tease those things apart. So maybe that's a registered psychologist, maybe that's a psychiatrist, and then there's other people in all different communities who may be able to fill that gap as well. So it's kind of a non-answer, but.
Well, it's interesting, Kelly. I'm going to just step in. You said something very interesting earlier when you said you didn't know why psychologists were not included in the number of, the people who were funded to do autism therapy under the Autism Funding Program in British Columbia, which, for those of you who don't know, it's funding that's set aside to pay certain professionals, certain professions and not others. And I think it was because, and I know probably because I am the institutional memory, is at that time, things like CBT and autism were, of course, not being discussed at all. And it was to try and get away from the idea that you could talk a child with autism out of their problems, because we all know that actually wasn't very successful. So I think that originally, in the early 2000s, that was the issue, that it was very much focused on applied behavior analysis, and the children that the therapy was or funding was being focused on was really nonverbal young children. And things have changed dramatically since 2000, 2002, and we're now looking at children being diagnosed who would not perhaps have been diagnosed then with autism, and they're older, and their issues are different but just as severe. And so I think that requires us to think again about how we provide service. But I think there's another issue as well, and again, this is not from a clinical perspective, this is from what I've seen at ACT in terms of the families contacting us, probably 1,000 families a year asking us for help in trying to understand how the system works. So we've spent a lot of time trying to think, how does the system work or not? And one of the factors, I think, has been that within children with special needs within the Ministry for Children and Family Development gets subsumed under this focus on child protection. So again, when a child is under threat from their family, that feels a lot more severe from the perspective of the social worker than a child who's parented by families who are, in general, trying very desperately to help them. And one of the reasons that we've always wanted to keep funding, particularly for special needs, as opposed to, all children are special, is because when you put a child who's under threat of physical or sexual abuse beside a child who has special needs that require specialized supports, the first category looks much more urgent, I think, to all of us. And then the second group never comes to the top of the list. And I think within MCFD services for children and youth with special needs, because of the focus on children who are in difficult family situations or perhaps not living with their family, that looks a lot more severe than where you have any family desperately trying to help any child from the perspective of the person trying to assess who is more needy will almost invariably choose the child who's under threat from their immediate circumstances. Together, this means that children with special needs in general and children with autism quite often in particular, because again, they may not have an intellectual disability, they may be quite articulate, they may be an absolute pain in the ass as well, and I speak as the parent of one. You know, you look at that and you think, here's a very functional family, they're very invested in their child, that's not our priority. We're now looking at having probably, 1 in 61, 1 in 65 children in the province of British Columbia. I think it's 1 in 61 children receiving autism funding. That's an awful lot of kids. And when they don't have access to services, because they're never any time on the top of that priority list, and when the funding that they do get is really focused on a methodology which is really good for small children with autism who are nonverbal, but not so good for the more verbal older children, we have a fairly dysfunctional system at the moment. So I'm hoping that this Ministry of Mental Health, I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket, because I am the institutional memory, but I think that that could be very effective in saying, not just setting up a ministry, but how are we going to set up outcome measures for figuring out what kind of standards are we going to have in the province? How long do children have to wait for a diagnosis of mental health or autism or whatever? You know, we're now reaching, I think, at the point in British Columbia where we have a pretty sophisticated understanding of many things. I think we could do better. And I think a lot of the people in the room, I know many of you, share my concerns that we're spending an awful lot of time monitoring wait lists instead of actually providing service. But we have a question from over here.
This message is for Jonathan. I'm just wondering how often you see if you can touch on the differentiating between executive functioning skill deficits and autism.
So the question was around differentiating between executive functioning skills deficits and autism, and I don't typically differentiate the. I don't see them on a kind of as separate from each other per se. That it's like a different dimension. That one can vary in terms of their socio-communicative and kind of behavioral pattern profiles, as well as in terms of their executive functioning profiles. And in some ways, the executive functioning profiles help me as a clinician to best tailor my approach to that person with autism. So I see it as an aspect of understanding the whole person. It's rare that that the differential question, at least for me, that I've been referred to, has been: does this person have, for example, a learning disability or autism, or executive functioning difficulties or autism? But more along the lines of what are their executive functioning pattern styles like in light of their autism? So understanding the whole person.
Question here?
Yeah, my question, and I appreciate the conversation around CBT. My question is with respect to DBT. I'd like to have a perspective on whether or not DBT would be more effective for certain children with autism than CBT.
So there is an emerging literature now on the use of dialectical behavior therapy approaches to improving resilience and emotional functioning in people with autism, given, again, a transdiagnostic approach of thinking beyond anxiety, specifically to a focus on mindfulness, a focus on, which has also increasing literature, a focus on distress tolerance, a focus on understanding the opposing views and potential dialectics, for example, right? There's a lot of intuitive sense in a lot of those approaches. The question is not, could those things help if you could improve them? The question is, how do you adapt the currently designed way of fostering DBT skills to people with autism so that they can take advantage of that? And it's just starting. There was a recent publication looking at adults who described, for example, how do you adapt this so it's clinically useful? It's just a few years down the line until we'll see the RCTs of the approach. But people are focusing on those aspects and increasingly considering, again, any initiatives that target ways of improving people's emotional functioning in a transdiagnostic way, given the underlying mechanisms that are likely at play.